Welcome to For Impact, the charity podcast. We're here to give a voice to the sector and talk about the taboos and challenges holding it back and what we can do about it. Our topic today is Trustees Behaving Badly. Has the sector set us up to fail? I'm Felicia Willow, founder of Interims for Impact and a charity specialist consultant. I work directly with charities on strategy, governance and crisis, and also work across the sector to address the systemic issues that hold For Impact organisations back. I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Pitt from the Benefit Group.
Hello, everyone.
So most trustees, we hope all trustees, join charity boards with good intentions, but poor trustee behaviour is one of the most common frustrations faced by charity leaders, fellow trustees and boards. Is it something about our sector, or is it the charity structure itself that's the problem? So in this episode, we explore why it is that there are so many examples of trustees behaving badly, and why it is so and what can be done about it.
Well, no surprises. This is another tricky one. I think in part because the sector desperately needs more and more diverse trustees. The 1 million plus trustees out there are the foundation of the sector. So we don't want to dissuade trustees in any way, but if they're not doing the job right, they're harming the sector. And I'm a trustee myself of a very small charity, but it definitely has been an eye-opening experience to really get to grips with what I thought a trustee was and what it really is. And as always, as I do on this podcast, I don't mind admitting that I'm used to boards, committees, all manner of meetings and governance of the highest order in financial services, but that doesn't automatically qualify me to be a great trustee. I've definitely learned a lot, and I've still got a lot more to learn, and will no doubt learn a lot on this podcast too.
This topic does feel like one of the biggest elephants in the room of our sector. And frankly, if I'm really honest, direct, I think efforts to respond to it keep painting within the lines and not really addressing how big an issue it is. You know, as I've mentioned before, about 7 months ago at the time of recording, a trustee I was aware of logged onto the Charity Commission website and removed all the other trustees with no authority to do so. And despite multiple reports to the Charity Commission, no action's been taken at all in 7 months. You know, throughout my years in the sector, I've seen trustees use their position for access and personal benefit repeatedly. I've seen really good CEOs lose their jobs. I've seen many people experience bullying and intimidation from trustees and really be left powerless to do anything about it. You know, for some years, it used to, the Charity Commission website actually used to say that you couldn't report trustee wrongdoing if you were the CEO or an employee because it was seen as an employment matter. Now, that is no longer the case, thankfully, but you kind of think if the Charity Commission doesn't investigate even when trustees are unlawfully removed by a rogue trustee, something that is actually supposed to be an offence, then what hope does the average CEO have in blowing the whistle? And, you know, we talked in one of our earlier episodes about the Akivo's CEO in Crisis service. It exists for this very reason. So it feels like there is quite a problem there that we really need to talk about. So let's meet our guests. Today we speak with Mary-Ann Ochota, a trustee who found herself facing an impossible governance situation, Penny Wilson, governance consultant, trainer and former CEO of Getting on Board, and Dr Vidya Sukumara Panicker, senior lecturer at Loughborough University, whose research explores trustee skills, governance and board effectiveness in charities. Let's get started.
I'm Mary-Ann Ochota. I'm a broadcaster, an author, and increasingly I'm working in strategic advisory and board roles, particularly around the environment and access to nature. I'm currently president of the Campaign to Protect Rural England, CPRE, and I'm chair of a partnership called the Protected Landscapes Partnership, which is working with national parks, national landscapes, and national trails. But all my work has been focused around people, nature, and the environment.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. The reason we have you on today, as you know, is because you've had direct experience of being on a board where you felt serious governance concerns were not being properly heard or managed. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience for some background?
So my experience was, it was my first role as a trustee, and it was for a charity which is dedicated to protecting and enhancing wild places. It's incorporated in Scotland, so it's covered by the Scottish charity regulator OSCAR. When you're first a trustee, it's really intimidating. You've got this pack of budget papers and financial documents. You need to get your head around corporate strategies. You know, you need to understand the staff structures and then like how a board works. And so in the first few months, I was kind of looking at these things saying, oh, I've got a few questions about this. And you can ask the chair, and I kind of got, you know, reasonable responses. And then there were a few things that I just thought, I don't really understand how this programme of work fits with the strategy, or I've got kind of strategic questions. But those ones got really pushed back. And I was kind of told that I was wrong, that it was operational. This is operational, not your business. And you're like, oh, okay, fair enough, my bad. So those questions, I was told that it wasn't appropriate for me to ask. And when questions were raised, not just by me, but by other trustees as well, in board meetings, it felt like there was a definite sort of divide and conquer strategy. We weren't really encouraged to talk to each other. All comms had to go through the chair and the secretariat. For example, if you wanted to email another board member and say, what do you think about this? There were a couple of issues. One, which was that the quote, it's operational. And so it's not your business to ask these questions, even though you feel like it's a strategic question. I'm not kind of worried what tea towels we're selling in the gift shop. I want to know, how is this going to impact the direction of the charity and how it serves its beneficiaries? But you kind of get told that. And as a new trustee, you're like, oh, sorry, I've made a mistake here. You assume it's you rather than misbehaviour or kind of poor governance. And then questions that were being asked by other trustees as well, it became increasingly clear that we were all being told that it's operational, even though more than one of us were raising the same concerns. And one of the ways that we didn't realise what other people thought was in board meetings, the agenda was very busy, people would make a comment, but there would be no space for actual discussion. And all comms, so emails there were kind of a new instruction that all emails had to go through the chair and secretariat. Trustees weren't allowed to email each other. And you kind of think that's a bit weird. But again, you want to be professional, you want to do a good job. And so you think, okay, well, if these are the rules, I'll try and follow the rules. And I think that was turned against us, basically, that people are trying to be professional. So you raise a question or you email the chair and you get rebuffed and you think, okay, well, it kind of feels like you're going a bit nuclear to bring it up again. It sort of undermines the chair's authority. And I don't want to do that. I want to do a good job as trustee and be corporate and kind of own my place in the board, not, try and, go rogue. And it's really difficult. The other experience was, I don't think that trustees are actually equipped or empowered to know what to do when governance goes wrong. I think often, you're a trustee on top of a busy life. And so you don't necessarily anticipate that it's going to start taking over because you've got to really start unearthing the governance issues and working out a kind of strategy to deal with your own chair or board. And there were a couple of times that I kind of raised questions in a board meeting online and got pretty strongly rebuffed, like really put in my place. And you're left reeling because you think, what did I do? What did I do that was wrong? Like, am I being unprofessional? Am I out of order? Have I got the wrong end of the stick here? And you feel like you're losing your mind a little bit because you're not having this experience in any other aspect of your professional life, but this one thing is kind of getting really weird. And other trustees would email me afterwards and say, oh, that was quite bruising. Are you okay? And I was thinking, well, no, not really. But also, why didn't you say something in the meeting? Because if you'd said something there and then, the conversation wouldn't have been shut down and I wouldn't have been targeted. And thanks for emailing, but now's the wrong time. You need to kind of, the bit where I'm Spartacus, you need to get off your chair and stand up and say, I'm Spartacus too, thanks very much. Otherwise, one person just gets nobbled. And it was just before an in-person board meeting and I was sitting packing my bag and I just burst into tears and I was like, I can't do this. I feel like it was taking such a mental toll. And there were a couple of big financial decisions that had been approved by the board and I had voted no. And I just thought, this level of whatever the reason, this level of apathy or silence around the table, I can't get behind. Once a decision has been made, the whole board has to align with it, even if you voted no in the vote. And I was like, I can't do it. It's too wrong. And honestly, it was actually only after I resigned that I realised how many other people were having exactly the same experience with the chair and that we had all been isolated and told that our tone was inappropriate, we were acting unprofessionally, the questions that we were asking that would require staff input in order to clarify were too taxing on the staff and that we need to be much more mindful of the kind of the work that they're doing and this isn't relevant. And I think when a chair and a chief exec collude to control and minimise the role of a board, you can get into very toxic places very quickly. And it's quite difficult to dismantle that. So I know, for example, the Scottish charity regulator, Oscar, has received numerous reports of concern from former trustees and senior staff members who've left. and they're investigating, they're working with the charity, but there's nothing public facing. So there's no reassurance that these issues are under control or being dealt with. And this is now 3 years later and it's still going on.
The thing about speaking up and not having people speak up in the room, I've seen that a number of times. I've been that person a number of times. I think when you're the person who says the thing, you often find yourself out on that limb alone. And then afterwards, when people go, oh, I was with you, it's like, but you didn't say anything. Did you ever get a sense, especially if other people were sending in reports and complaints afterwards or resigned afterwards, did you ever get a sense of why? What was the barrier in the way of them speaking up in that room? Why did they not feel that they could?
Do you know, I spent many sort of like really bruised weeks and months thinking that exact thing. I think that a lot of the time people are trustees because they want to do a nice thing. They don't want to get into a snake pit and fix stuff. They don't realise that's what you're signing up for. You kind of think it's going to be nice. It's going to make you feel good. You're going to go on some trips. You're going to help. It's going to look good on your CV. You've allocated a certain number of hours a month. So you're not in a headspace where you want it to start ballooning and taking over. But when things are starting to go wrong, when those little red flags, those alarm bells, people lean out and they hope for the best. And they think, well, the staff are great and the charity is still doing really good work. And so maybe it's not that, maybe they do the thought process of thinking, well, maybe it's just me and I don't get it. Or I think sometimes people just are lacking courage. I think the bottom line is that it requires a particular, kind of a steely nerve, particularly if you feel like you're in hostile territory, that a strong chair is not going to appreciate your intervention. But I think that's when being a trustee, that's when you're actually doing your job. That's when you step up. Now, I have seen it from the other side, of course, where boards are a bit rogue and they are, getting into all manner of operational detail that they probably shouldn't be in, and that there's the kind of sort of, a kind of element of, well, we've decided and so this is true. And so it can go both ways. But I think that it's really important that if you get the sense that the chair isn't convening space for meaningful conversation, really honest conversation, then, you need to do something about it.
Yeah. So do you think the current trustee model is effective? Or, if not, what would you like to see change?
So I think the board culture conversation, I think that could be fine. It could be fine. It requires chairs to have good training, for boards to be able to select good chairs. And actually, that's, I think, where the trustee model doesn't work. That in 2026, people are busy. Lots of households have, every adult is in paid or unpaid employment. Everybody is busy. There aren't that many times. And what you're then doing is only recruiting from a pool of trustees where people are retired professionals. And then we have the kind of circular conversation of, but hang on, shouldn't we have boards that are much more diverse, that bring a diversity of opinion, life experience, that, we should have younger trustees, we should have trustees from underrepresented groups. And you go, how is that person with caring responsibilities, a full-time job, small children, also going to be a trustee and basically do a job for free? And it does require a degree of you need to be able to get your head around a pack of papers, a set of legal documents that not only describe what your legal responsibility as a trustee is, but what the charity's legal duties are. You need to get your head around corporate strategy, and that's not to diminish people who aren't retired professionals. There's lots of people with really fantastic experience who can completely be in that governance space. But I think just asking people to work quite long hours for free isn't ever going to be straightforward. And I think it's very difficult to say you can only do this if you have time, the luxury, the privilege of being able to volunteer.
If someone is listening to this and they're starting to notice some similarities with their experience, maybe they're a CEO, maybe they're a trustee, what would you advise them to do with the benefit of hindsight?
I spent long months thinking, what should I have done different? Because I felt so guilty that I'd walked away. I felt like I'd betrayed the staff and betrayed the beneficiaries. If you're in a position of power, so if you're a chair or a chief exec, or perhaps another member of the senior leadership team, and you're like, things don't seem quite right here, then I think probably the first thing to do would be to get someone external in, like that fresh pair of eyes, that independent voice of someone to do kind of a board effectiveness piece of work with you, which is one of the ways for someone to reflect back the board culture and kind of go, no, that's not normal. And then I think keeping those lines of communication open. So trustees having opportunities to know what the staff are doing. Trustees having an opportunity to go and see whatever the charity is, what projects, what does the work look like? Not in order to get into the operational, you shouldn't have these tea towels in the gift shop, of course, or these are too many people working on that project. That's not your job. But what your job is to understand how the charity functions, how the arms and legs work. So you can then go back to the brain and kind of go, okay, well, let's think about that. I think that as soon as you're controlling comms and sort of gatekeeping a flow of information, I think alarm bells should be ringing. But it's really difficult as a trustee to say, I think we should be able to WhatsApp each other, and to feel like if you did do that, it's being like unprofessional. You're going against the things that your chair has told you to do. What have I learned? I've learned that speaking up sometimes slaps you in the face and you're the one with the bruises. And I've also learned that I don't know what I would do next time.
I think the reality is, I've stood up for things. I've had myself slapped and bruised as a result. And I think that's sometimes where those people are like that, isn't it? They don't want to be slapped and bruised, but I don't ever want to be the person who doesn't stand up for something that's right because I'm afraid of that. So, yeah, I guess it's a question of how can you build courage in people because, there is that risk.
When you're expressing a kind of a point of like disagreement, it's the disagreeing well, the kind of actually let's unpack why we have different opinions about this. Or I think if it's not happening organically, perhaps you need to formalise and propose a kind of a more formal approach to the pros and the cons, the concerns, the risks, and actually do a kind of a real appraisal of, have we understood all the things? But again, it's really difficult when the kind of processes are being maliciously controlled so that, the window for consultation is we need all answers or responses back by Thursday evening and only email me, not the group. So the only person who sees what everyone else has said is the one person who might be the problem. Is really difficult. It is really difficult.
And I think way outside the role of chair. I think that's the thing. Sometimes you do get people coming from the corporate world where chairs have more power and they behave like that in the charity sector. The chair is just the person who chairs the meetings and whatever power is delegated to them. They might have a casting vote, but they can't do anything that hasn't been delegated. So if the board has not delegated those powers to them, they don't have those powers unless you have a very strange constitution. And that's a tricky thing to challenge though, isn't it?
It's really tricky because it's partly culture. And then in my experience, although after my term as board, I think what happened was that the board was encouraged to delegate more power.
Oh dear.
Yeah, so now it's codified. And you kind of think, okay, well, you are, right-thinking adults. There is a point at which you probably have to wake blinking and step into the light and go, what was I a part of?
Yeah.
But in the meantime, you see, particularly with charities that are particularly run on legacies, you just think, that was £1 million of someone's life that is being wasted on NDAs for staff who've left under a cloud. And you just think, that's not okay, is it?
Thank you so much, Mary-Ann, for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate your time and honesty with all of this.
You're really welcome. Thanks for talking to me.
I'm Penny Wilson. I'm a charity governance consultant. I train and write about trustees. I'm director of the Festival of Trusteeship and I'm a trustee at London Plus.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Penny, for coming on the podcast. Now, I can imagine you have seen your fair share of trustee challenges over the years. What do you think of when we talk about trustees going bad?
I think that most trustee bad behaviour is quite low level. When you ask people what is bad trustee behaviour, and actually I do often ask people that in my workshops, they'll tend not to start talking about embezzling funds or terrible bullying behaviour. They'll talk about trustees not being prepared, about not knowing enough about the organisation, about not listening as much as they should, about not debating, and really commonly about stepping into kind of staff territory, about being too operational. It's still really disruptive, all of that low-level behaviour. So I don't want to downplay it. And I also think that all of us have an inner prat, and all trustees are capable sometimes of not acting our best.
It's funny. I remember the book that Deborah Alcock-Tyler wrote. It's
Battle on the Board.
Battle on the Board. That's the one. And they have a quiz, and I used to do that as some part of my trustee training. Is like make them think about that, because I think it's a really interesting way of people who are often trying to be well-meaning not realizing how much of a prat they might be actually coming across to the people on the other side of the table. So I thought that was such a gentle and amusing way of getting people to maybe reflect on some of that. And I guess that kind of leads me to, why do so many trustees think they're helping when they're actually making things worse? And when do you think good intent becomes actually destructive behaviour?
I really think it's important to focus on that good intent, because I think most trustees are good people who became trustees for good reasons. They want to make a difference. They want to do something for the cause that they care about. But is it surprising that we do get trustee bad behaviour, given that most trustees are informally recruited? Most trustees receive no induction. Most trustees get no training. There's no explicit agreement in most charities about what we actually want from our trustees. So I don't think it's that surprising that we get behaviours that we don't really want, because we have spent almost zero effort in most charities kind of talking to trustees about what the role is and what we want from them. In terms of tipping points into worse behaviour, I think there's lots of things that can tip behaviour over. So, for example, trustees having very entrenched views, often due to being there for a very long time. Trustees not respecting the organisation, the people in it, the people it serves. I think sometimes that is due to this narrative that people buy into about charities being lesser than other sorts of organisations, which I know is something that gets your goat, Felicia. And again, I think this comes back to how we recruit trustees, not contextualising our knowledge. So trustees who come along who are perfectly useful trustees on paper, in fact, they could be brilliant trustees on paper, but actually if they're not taking their prior knowledge and adapting it to the organisation they're stepping into, they're not thinking, this is a registered charity. I've not worked or volunteered in one of those before. This is a much smaller organisation. This is operating in a cause area I know very little about. Actually, if you don't contextualise what you already know, you're never going to be as good a trustee as you might be.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. I think some of that expectations and that respect question, when you see people come in and if they've got the attitude of, I am here to bestow my great wisdom and I'm doing everyone a favour, and then that's not received well because actually you don't understand the sector, you haven't put the learning in, and you're being really quite annoying and unhelpful, that then people can be quite affronted because they've come in with a totally different expectation about what they're doing there. And I think it's a difficult thing because I think sometimes people beg people to come onto boards and maybe fall into some of that, you'd be so brilliant, you know so much, you've seen so much. And that accountability and that learning and that fundamental respect just seems to kind of get ignored, but it's so important. And I do think without it, it does come back to bite you, really, doesn't it?
It really does. And, I have some sympathy because although those trustees present as some of the biggest prats on the planet, actually I have some sympathy for that because, we know that more than 50% of trustees were invited to join the board compared to 6% responding to an advert. And if, as you've described, you are, please, Felicity, please come and join our board, you'll be brilliant. Of course you're going to go in thinking, I'm going to be really useful here, I'm doing someone a favour, get me. Of course you are. So it does all come back to that flawed recruitment.
Yeah. And it does feel like, obviously I've seen a lot of bad cases myself, and I've experienced some as well as CEO, and it's quite tricky, but it feels like sometimes the worst cases seem to start with something quite simple that wasn't dealt with at an early stage. So why do you think so many boards seem to tolerate, I guess, what starts off as minor behaviour, but then turns into quite bad behaviour for so long?
Yeah, I really agree with this. I think most big governance issues could have been nipped in the bud a lot earlier. I don't think trustees are brave enough. And I think there's There's lots of reasons for that. And I think two of the reasons are we treat trustees differently because they're volunteers. We think we can't possibly expect that of them, or we can't possibly tell them that isn't appropriate because they're volunteering their time. And I think that's really misguided, because as a trustee myself, as a volunteer, I want clarity. I want to do a good job. That's why I'm there. So if I'm doing something which is making it not a good job, I want to know ASAP. And I think the other thing that can happen is that trustees that aren't the chair sit there seeing something unravelling and they think it's somebody else's job to sort it out. They think either the CEO, if there is one, or the chair will sort out what they're seeing. And I think it isn't always the case, apart from the fact that sometimes the problem is the CEO or the chair. Actually, the CEO or chair may not have noticed. They're very busy in board meetings, and you might have noticed, for example, that one trustee is constantly shutting another trustee down. And perhaps that trustee is younger or from a different minoritized group. You've noticed that. They may not have even noticed it. And I think it's the role of every trustee around a board table to make sure that board is functioning well. And if you notice something that isn't quite right, the earlier you can say it, the better. And it's much easier to say it neutrally and calmly when it's a recent thing. It's really actually quite hard to have a difficult conversation when it's developed into a monster issue that nobody's been tackling.
Yeah, I think that volunteer issue that you mentioned is really interesting, because it's something that we know the Charity Commission feel very strongly about. We know I feel quite differently, but I think that it comes with, so again, some attitudes around the role, like the accountability. I've had trustees say to me things like they shouldn't have to do development or they shouldn't have to have feedback because it's just a volunteer role. And it feels like that also translates into, this is a volunteer role. I'm choosing to do this because I want to do something I enjoy. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of calling out someone else's behavior. I want to have a nice time, doing the happy stuff. But I think there's, that whole volunteer idea about the fact that you can't be a volunteer and be accountable. You can't be a volunteer and be professional. Like, there's a real problem there, it feels.
There's a huge problem with that. And I think it's back to, if we don't set the expectations as to what somebody is signing up for as a trustee, then again, we shouldn't be surprised when they're only in it for the good and not the challenging. We've got to set the expectation so that somebody can think, do I want to sign up for this? This might not all be rosy.
Yeah.
There could be issues, and I am legally going to have to deal with it if there are issues. We just need to be really clear. And I think that trustees do prefer the good. Of course they do. We're human beings. And actually, exactly, all humans prefer the good. We don't really want a funding crisis. We don't want a key member of staff to resign. We don't want a safeguarding issue. We don't want any of that. We sign up for the good stuff, but we have to recognise that the bad stuff is part of the gig.
Part of it. And actually, if you can't say to somebody, something about the way they spoke to someone else, are you going to be able to disagree with that person when you're having a debate about something really fundamental to the charity's strategic direction? We all have to be brave in those board meeting rooms. And that's, I think, one of the challenges I'm always, talking about, is getting that good debate. So what do you think causes or allows bad behavior? Do you think we have a disproportionate number of just terrible, terrible people coming in as trustees? Is it how we're structured as a sector? Is it something else? What do you think that kind of enables this?
I think we definitely don't have a disproportionate number of terrible people, quite the opposite. And I can say that with some confidence because I work with thousands and thousands of trustees every year. I think the reasons are many and varied. I think trustees don't necessarily understand the role. I think the people that work with trustees, like charity managers, don't necessarily understand the role. I think trustees can think they're behaving in the right way if there hasn't been an explicit agreement about behaviour. Then back to informal recruitment, if we've been recruited by just by being asked and doing somebody a favour. Sometimes trustees feel that they can't leave, and I think that can cause bad behaviour. And we're terrible at using trustee terms and actually helping to keep that refreshing of boards. Sometimes it's practical barriers. So, for example, if the papers are routinely coming out a day before the meeting, is it any surprise that only half the trustees are able to read them? Or if meetings are always in someone's working hours, or if we're not paying expenses and somebody's worried about the travel expenses to get there, these practical things are actually quite easy to fix, but they can be really big barriers for people. And then I think life. like life causes bad behaviour, in that somebody might be poorly, they might have their caring responsibilities might have changed, they might have money worries, they might have had a promotion which is giving them a lot more work. All of these things get in the way of being a decent trustee. And I don't think we allow the airtime to talk about those things sometimes. So for example, Bob, I know he hasn't been to the last 4 meetings. Nobody's had a conversation with Bob to say, Bob, are you okay? Is something happening? We noticed that you've not been to the meetings. So we were so timid about having these explicit conversations.
Obviously, charities do tend to pride themselves on being collaborative, and I know a lot of boards see consensus as a goal, but is there a point at which kindness and that collaboration becomes avoidance and consensus becomes groupthink? Are we seeing that some of those, I guess, charitable style values actually coming out in a toxic way?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a false narrative, isn't there, that because we're charitable, we've got to just be all kind of
warm and fuzzy.
Yeah, warm, fuzzy, and cuddle each other and agree all the time. And I think this debate, it goes on a spectrum. And if we imagine a kind of rainbow shape, and at one end of our rainbow, we've got trustees scrapping and fighting and saying rude things to each other, and it getting very personal, and emails are flying about. And every trustee would recognise that as really poor behaviour. But at the other end of our rainbow, we've got this very consensus-driven board where everybody's agreeing and we're congratulating ourselves on never falling out and on, gosh, yeah, we're all aligned. That's brilliant. We've finished early. We can go home for our tea. That's all warm and cuddly. But actually, that is also poor governance. And that end goes under the radar all the time. I see it all the time. So we have to find a way of kind of moving to the top of the rainbow and being able to debate these thorny issues, being able to disagree with each other respectfully, yes, kindly still, but actually just having that as a core part of how we do trusteeing.
Absolutely. I know I've mentioned this book on the podcast before, but Matthew Side's Rebel Ideas, I think, is such a great book for explaining why consensus is a sign that you don't have the right people in the room, or that people don't feel safe enough to actually say what they really think. But yeah, a lot of the reviews I do, people celebrate consensus, and it's actually a sign of the opposite. It's not good governance. It's quite bad if you're easily getting to consensus.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree with you more on that.
And sometimes it's because trustees have been there too long. Because I think if you have been in the same room with the same group of people, you can become very aligned, and it might just be a sign that actually you might have had some good debate. You can move along this rainbow to and fro. You might have had some good debate in the past, but as you're getting too friendly, you're becoming too consensus driven.
That shared mental maps. I can't remember the person who wrote about those, but yeah. What about chairs? So I always think it's really interesting that legally speaking, if you read charities' constitution, chairs are just the person who are chairing any meeting, and they might have a casting vote in that meeting. And of course, in reality, in most charities, it's a huge role, and it can often make or break a charity. So do you think chairs might be one of the biggest governance risks in the sector?
They're probably one of the biggest risks. I think they're also one of the biggest saviours. So I guess we could frame it negatively or positively, but chairs are often incredible human beings putting so much time and effort into chairing. And I think, too many don't understand that they're there to conduct the board and to mix music metaphors. They're there as the conductor, not the rock star or the lead singer. There's a misunderstanding around that. But again, I have real sympathy because it's a big, big job being a chair, and it comes with a lot of stress and strain. So actually, there's a tendency sometimes to not to want debate, to not want messy meetings where people are disagreeing, to try and kind of sew up the decisions before we ever get into the room, to finish on time, to get all the admin done. That pull is very strong, and some chairs don't get the balance right.
Yeah. It's so tricky when I see a board of trustees trying to choose, when a chair is leaving and they're trying to choose the next chair, or should they go out? And it's very rarely a question of what skills do we really need in the chair. We really need a chair to be supporting the CEO and to working across the board and to build that team and actually it's often, well, I can't do it because I've got a full-time job. So-and-so's retired. They probably have enough time and that person's willing, so they step up. And it's like, all power to them. But at the same time, there's not that luxury of almost going, who is the best person for this? Or should we go out and get someone? And I agree with you that I see chairs doing the most extraordinary things, sometimes too much. They can be burnout on that when they've got big things going on. And I would just say association chairs doing some great stuff out there to support chairs. So if chairs are listening, definitely join them if you haven't already. And what do you see as the role of the Charity Commission in all of this? So, as you know, I'm often quite frustrated that the Charity Commission is so toothless and it fails to address some of the very bad behaviour that I've seen. I think it was last year, they suspended 34 people, 34 trustees, and people were like, oh, wow, this is so amazing. Last year, they only did 17. And I was there going, well, I've met about 10 this year myself in my work that I do. So 34 seems pretty piddling in such a big sector. So how do you see their role?
I think it's not their job to police our bad behaviour when it's low level. I think it's bizarre that we would say, hey, regulator, please tell us off more. We're being naughty over here. Come and see what we're doing. Look, I'm pinching my sibling. To me, it's bizarre, and we need to take responsibility for it. We need to take responsibility for it as individual organisations, but we also need to take responsibility for it as a sector. And trustees are monumentally poorly supported and networked in the charity sector. We've got 1 million people. The vast majority of them are unpaid volunteers. And we've just got a handful of really brilliant but very poorly resourced organisations supporting them. And that feels just ridiculous, frankly, that we wouldn't pay more attention to our most senior leaders. And I don't think it's the Commission's job. Myself, I know we disagree on that. I'm here for the fight. Bring it on.
But of course, you were the CEO at Getting On Board, which is sadly no longer with us. We have fewer organisations to support trustees than we used to. And I guess that's why I kind of moved towards more of I would like to see greater regulation, because I think the regulation we've got, it's not good enough. And I completely agree. I wouldn't expect the regulator to be getting involved in something minor, like they send a letter if someone hasn't come to 6 meetings. We can sort that out. But, when we have really bad behaviour, I'd like to see them be a bit more active in it, because it does feel like that's connected with the accountability. We need the funders to fund if we're going to have those kind of organisations, and we can't keep losing them.
No, that's right. We do need, and I've got an axe to grind here, but we do need more funders. At the moment we've got 2 grant makers who have trustee support, governance support in what they will fund in open, in grants as a kind of specified bit of their strategy. 2 out of thousands and thousands of grant makers. And that does seem crazy. And as we said earlier, so many big governance problems start small. If trustees understood their responsibilities better, if they knew how to recruit openly, if they did good inductions. So actually we need to rise up the quality of trustee support for individual organisations via infrastructure organisations. And, it could have a small amount of money could make a very big difference to what charity governance looks like.
Yeah. And you and I are saying that both as people who make money selling training to trustees and working with boards and that kind of thing. But the reality is that individual consultants are not going to make the systemic difference. We need those infrastructure bodies. I completely agree.
Yes. We need it at scale. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, Penny. It's been great to talk to you as always.
Thank you.
Hi, Felicia. My name is Vidya Panicker. I'm an academic and researcher based in Loughborough University and Loughborough Business School. I research on topics relating to governance and strategy in various kinds of organizations.
Great. Well, I was very excited to find you and meet you. I can't believe we hadn't met before I started looking into this podcast. So thank you so much for joining us. The first question I have for you is what led you to study trustee skills and governance in smaller charities? And what questions were you hoping to answer?
So, Felicia, my academic and research background is in corporate governance. So, since my PhD days, so that's more than a decade, I've been studying boards, board composition, director skills, but primarily within corporate settings. Now, a few years ago, due to the different turn of events, I became a trustee myself. Now, what surprised me was when I realized how many of my assumptions, which I had developed through my years researching in corporate governance, that did not really translate neatly into the charity sector. So that sparked an interest in the researcher in me, but particularly smaller charities. That's the focus area of my research. I research smaller charities because they usually tend to have fewer resources, as we know, and they have fewer staff, mostly volunteer run. And because of these, they have a much greater reliance on trustees and their skills.
Oh, great. So as your research has progressed on that track, what's been the most surprising insights or patterns that have started to emerge?
There were several surprises, and that is honestly what makes research the most exciting. But I would perhaps touch upon the most surprising 3 aspects that came out of this research. First, skills are not what I thought they were. because my assumption was that skills would be predominantly related to the financial or the legal expertise or the fundraising expertise. And I genuinely expected trustees to emphasize this in the conversations. But what I noticed was that they repeatedly talked about listening, about judgment, about empathy, relationship building, communication, understanding the values of the charity, understanding the community they serve. So that's when I realized that many trustees viewed behavioral skills as equally important, or sometimes even more important than the technical skills, which I assume were of the primary importance. The second surprising aspect was that trustees in smaller charities often do a lot more than governance. Now, if you look at the traditional model of governance, trustees govern and staff operate. But in smaller charities, that distinction that very frequently breaks down because trustees often help with fundraising, they help with networking, with recruitment, sometimes even on the operational aspects of the firm. Right. So that division of responsibilities are a lot vaguer than I had initially assumed it would be. And finally, and this shouldn't have come as a surprise to me because I went through this myself as a trustee, but most trustees begin their role without fully understanding what trusteeship means or what it involves. A surprising number of people actually told me that they had very little idea when they began their role. They learned while doing it. And many of them, not many of them, some of them are still not really sure what the trustee role is or how it was different from the volunteer role, for instance, that they started with in their charity.
So I know that your research is still ongoing. Obviously, we're looking today at, the trustees gone bad and what kind of contributes to that. So far, what are the kind of deeper issues you've identified that stop trustees from, I guess, making their full contribution?
My observation is that there isn't a skill shortage. So the issue predominantly is not the shortage of skills. I think it is more of a mismatch between the capability and the opportunity situation here. So many trustees actually join the board and they are particularly handpicked to the board because they have valuable skills, but they often struggle to deploy them. And I think that's where the failure happens. And my research showcased, I guess, 4 predominant factors which leads to this lack of deployment of the skills. And I would start with role ambiguity. Again, one point that I touched upon briefly before. Trustees not always know what is expected of them. So, what is their role? Are they strategists? Are they advisors? Are they volunteers? Or do they still contribute to the operational aspects? So, different charities and teams and boards are also unclear about this. Even the sector experts are unclear about it. So, nobody can really define where the role of trustees, how it is defined. So, what are the precise considerations which come within the role? So, that ambiguity is still there. And that predominantly is one of the reasons why trustees cannot always contribute their 100%. And there is very limited onboarding, even in small, particularly in smaller charities. The amount of onboarding opportunities which are available to the trustees is severely limited. Structured induction, it doesn't always exist. So usually you learn through the trial and error process. And many, for instance, me, I was given a package which involved some readings when I joined the board, and people don't always enjoy reading, and that's the reality of it. And time constraints, obviously, we have to consider that too, because trustees at the end of the day are doing this voluntarily, right? So even the most highly skilled trustees struggle to contribute as much because all of us have competing commitments to our time. And I would add this point about the board culture, or perhaps to use a more modern term, the vibe of the board. So no matter how much skill I go in with, how excited I am, if the board is dominated by a small number of voices, or if challenging voices are discouraged, then obviously the contributions are going to be compromised, right? So I would again stress the point that the issue is not always skill or capability. It's mostly the condition in which that capability can actually be used effectively.
Yeah. And what has your research found about the kinds of trustee behaviours or the board dynamics that seem to cause the greatest difficulties for charities and perhaps their CEOs?
Again, going back to the leading question of my research, again, I wouldn't say it's technical. I would say it's predominantly relational, which leads to this dynamics, which really doesn't do well with the contribution of the trustees. Again, I would mention the misunderstanding of the role part, because sometimes trustees become too engaged with the operational aspects and they try to manage rather than govern. some others become distant and then they become disengaged. And these are both problematic situations. You don't want somebody who is disengaged, but at the same time, you don't want someone who is micromanaging all the aspects of how the charity works, right? And then there is a problem with the engagement. Now, sometimes there are these charities, and before every conversation, I would go through their board profile. And there are some amazing board profiles. And when you look at the credentials of these individuals on the board, you would assume it's the best board out there, right? But that is not always the case. So a board which can really appear healthy on paper, the trustees need not always meaningfully participate or engage with the firm. So one sector leader interestingly used this term recreational trustees, which is a case where trustees use the charity board meetings as an opportunity for social engagement. So you come, you engage with individuals, and you go. So you have an amazing profile, but this particular dynamic where you don't engage with the team, it is just detrimental to the charity, as we can imagine. Lack of diversity in boards, and I know, Felicia, that this is a conversation which is very close to your heart. It is a very different conversation to be had, but let me highlight the challenge with diversity of perspective on trustee boards, right? Because many boards recruit through existing networks. Again, another conversation to be had, the lack of formal recruitment. But when you recruit through your existing network, you end up with people who think similarly, who come from the same background, who will not challenge each other, and who in all probability look exactly the same too. And I think one of the key takeaways for me from this interview in terms of board dynamics is the role of the chair. Again, despite my role as a charity trustee, I don't think that I had really regarded the criticality of the chair and the chair CEO relationship, because the chair determines whether a challenge is constructive. The chair is the one who can ensure that trustees are contributing effectively. The chair is the one who can determine that the CEOs are actually feeling supported and being supported. So the chair has enormous influence on governance quality and determining the dynamics of the board.
So, do you think that the current trustee model is still fit for purpose, or do you think it's time to rethink charity governance more fundamentally?
That's a very interesting question, right? And I think it's a very serious question which is discussed in the charity sector and in the circles generally at this point. My take is that I genuinely don't think the model is broken. Okay, I think it's a resilient model, and I do believe that the founding principles like stewardship and accountability that the trusteeship embodies right now, I think they are incredibly important. But what I do believe or feel from my research is that the model that we describe right now on paper, is that the model that we actually have right now? That is the interesting question, because if you read the governance guidance, what are trustees? They are the strategic overseers, right? They set the directions, they provide scrutiny, they hold the executive team to account. So it's a very neat picture, right? But when you speak to trustees in smaller charities, this is not what they actually do. So they are not just governing, they are not just strategically overseeing the charity, they're helping in the recruitment, they are fundraising, they are mentoring. And when there is an operational problem, they're troubleshooting. And then they are representing the organization. And when there is a crisis ongoing, they step in because there's nobody else available to do that, right? So smaller charities are not governed by trustees anymore. In many instances, they're actually sustained by trustees. And there is the problem. The problem here is that we continue to describe the role as governance, but we are actually relying on the trustees for a lot more than governance. We are relying on them for leadership, for their networks, for their advocacy. So I don't think we need to abandon trusteeship, and that's my take on it, but I really believe that we should think about what the role has become. So if we expect our trustees to be governors, if we expect them to be fundraisers, their ambassadors, then we have to really rethink how we recruit them and how we support them and develop them and help them prepare for this role that we are expecting from them.
I think that issue of trustees stepping into operations at times is a really interesting one, because in one way, as you say, it's completely outside what the role's supposed to be. And I've definitely met people who've come from the corporate world going, I'm really confused by this. This is a really strict line on a corporate board. But it also, and it's a brilliant thing when you've got a trustee who's able to step in, but also recognize the fact that they're stepping kind of in underneath the senior leadership team. That works. But it's also almost like it's a weakness in the system too, because it can also then lead to conflict. And trustees then, I've had a situation where someone said they'd come in and help. And the next thing I know, they brought it up at a board meeting. And it's like, no, this is an operational matter that you were coming in to help with. This isn't a board matter. So it's a really interesting thing in the charity sector, I think, that we have. Like, it's wonderful that trustees will do this, but at the same time, it does bring with it almost like the potential for downfall,
Agreed.
Yeah, really interesting. If you could change one thing to help trustees be more effective and I guess avoid going bad, what would it be?
I would say that one thing that we can really change would relate to trustee development and onboarding. I have spoken to more than 45 trustees and CEOs and sector leaders combined at this point, and I'm really convinced that we don't have a trustee skills problem. Obviously, there are boards where the boards are struggling with skilled trustees, but I don't think that is the wider problem here or the larger problem here. I think the problem predominantly relates with the development of trustees. So if every trustee can really understand their role and enter this role with clear expectations and a meaningful induction process and some level of mentoring and support and the actual confidence to contribute, I think that would be a game changer when it comes to being able to do their best or being really able to contribute in alignment with the skills that they possess and come to the board with.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I can't wait to see future research that you do in the sector. We need more research in our sector. So it's really great to hear that you're working on this. But thank you for joining us.
It was really lovely being a part of this podcast. And thank you for inviting me, Felicia.
More cracking contributions there, so a big thank you to all of our guests. And for me, I think there's a clear theme here about bad behaviour being the symptom, not the cause. And I think the causes are numerous, from bad recruitment in the first place to lack of support, lack of openness, lack of challenge. And I think this feels like it's a particularly small charity issue where trustees are recruited to do a job, not govern. So they become too involved in running the charity from day one. And there is no consideration of what their governance skills are actually like and how they're going to work with the board. So there's no surprise, therefore, that they don't do this well, can fill out their depth and start overstepping or behaving badly. There's also a bit of a nature-nurture argument that has come out here. I think we all agree, as you said originally, Felicia, that the vast majority of trustees have good intentions. They wouldn't have stepped into the role otherwise. However, you put a good person in a dysfunctional environment, and at best, they can't do a good job. And at worst, they become part of the problem.
What really comes through for me is that there is such a spectrum of bad behaviour. So at one end, there are trustees who are getting it wrong because they're unclear, they're anxious, they're overinvested, they're poorly inducted or trained, or they're too used to being the expert or the boss in another setting. Then there are boards where the culture has gone wrong, challenge is discouraged, the chair holds too much power, the CEO might be isolated, you've got trustees closing ranks. People might be able to see the problem but not be able to shift it. But then there are trustees who are actively using the role badly for control, access, status, commercial benefit, personal power. And it feels misleading to mix these things together. If we treat all poor trustee behaviour as a development issue, we end up responding to serious misconduct with training and induction. Is that going to actually solve anything?
Yeah, I think there's a real conundrum here because I think, as I said in the opening, we need to recruit trustees, but I think we should be advertising it as the most challenging job you've ever done. You might have been very senior in business, but you won't have experienced anything like this. Charity work is deeply important. It changes lives. You will be responsible for overseeing, not doing, life-changing work. And you'll have nowhere near, I think, the training, support, benefit of teams of experts around you, which you might have experienced in the past. So, it doesn't sound like a great job advert at the moment, but also for all of these reasons, I think it's the best thing you could possibly do. I've definitely learned that trusteeship is courageous work, but trustees need to enter into it with their eyes wide open.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of the things that people talked about today, clarity of role, trustee induction, recruitment processes, board development, they do make a difference. But the reality I'm sitting with here is that there is still this massive gap in our sector. And that's what we really need. And that gap is accountability. We don't actually have true accountability. And good governance is only as good as each board allows it to be. We have to admit that the oversight of the sector is inadequate. And that leaves trustees with too much power to abuse. Because can you really be accountable when there's no consequences for breaking the rules? Without true oversight from the Charity Commission, without consequences for really bad behaviour, I don't see how the current board system is effective or workable.
I'm also wondering whether their insecurity is at the root of a lot of these issues. And I think you have to be pretty magnanimous to walk into a trustee role and admit that you don't know what you're doing, particularly if you have been very senior in business. And I think you need a very positive environment for trustees to feel comfortable admitting what they don't know, but you need it for a really functional trustee board.
Yeah. And of course, this is going back to one of my things I harp on about, and that's voluntary trusteeship. I think that there's this risk that voluntary trusteeship makes this sense that it's harmless or it's not important. But, being unpaid doesn't make it someone harmless. Trustees can do real damage. And all of these things that we need to do to make the role more effective for people, recruitment, induction, board development, really matter. But they do assume that people are there for the right reasons and are willing to learn. And the reality is that some trustees are not. And I think that's a really uncomfortable thing to admit. And in my opinion, I think the sector may have set itself up to fail by giving trustees this enormous power, wrapping that power up in the language of voluntary service, and then having very weak mechanisms for dealing with those who abuse it. So until we're more honest about the damage trustees can do, I think CEOs, staff, beneficiaries, and good trustees are going to keep paying the price.
Well, no shortage of pithy conversation in this episode, and another important issue, as promised, faced head on.
Thanks to all of our guests today, and thanks to the Benefit Group for supporting this podcast.